I know you're from Italy, from
Yeah.
the university.
Venice, from Venice, from Venice.
Okay, wonderful. And you're, yeah, I leave the word to you from, I don't remember the Italian word, University San Raffaele?
San Raffaele, Milano.
Milan. Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. So thanks a lot. The floor is yours.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the invitation. For several years, Giorgio Agamben has been insisting on the need to conduct an archaeological investigation into the mechanism that has reduced the human being to bare life. Resuming in an original way the last philosophy of Michel Foucault, Agamben has shown the origin of modern biopolitics, whose tragic conclusion, according to Agamben, was revealed at Auschwitz, should be sought in the figure of the Homo sacer, to whom he dedicated a very long analysis. Contrary to Carl Schmitt's opinion, according to Agamben, the fundamental political category is not the friendly enemy opposition, but the dialectic between bare life and political existence. Perhaps it is not really a dialectic. For Agamben, there is neither opposition nor separation, but a sort of inclusive negation between bare life and political existence. In any case, I don't believe that is a simple juxtaposition, as he has objected to. From his point of view, in Greek metaphysics, there are the fundamental philosophical categories thanks to which the history of the West have created bare life as a sacred dimension, at the same time inviolable and expendable. As fascinating as it may seem, Agamben's perspective may seem an abstract construction, as objected to any philosophy such as Heidegger's, that sees metaphysics as the key to reading the religious and political history of the West. Well, the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic has abruptly placed the thought of Agamben at the center of a debate that is something sometimes bitter, but very interesting. In the last few months, Agamben has published 16 posts on the website of a Quodlibet publishing house, now collected in a book, A che punto siamo? L'epidemia come politica. The fear of a contagion, which has spread with an aggressiveness no less than the epidemic itself, has brought out a variety of phenomena, from the silent resignation of the most to real episodes of mass hysteria. Not the contagion, but the social reaction to it will be, according to Agamben, the result of a metaphysical machine that for centuries has created bare life as the sacred dimension, at the same time included and excluded from political construction. However, if a device has been known for a long time, the social phenomena we are witnessing seem to Agamben unreleased. Such a stance has cost Agamben a series of criticisms, even a very harsh one, more often formulated in the form of ad hominem objections. Behind this criticism, on which it will be better to overlook, I find his basic hypothesis interesting. According to Agamben, what emerges in the current COVID-19 emergency is the centrality of bare life. In order to safeguard it, it seems that all political, emotional, and religious belief can and must be sacrificed. How was this possible? In Agamben opinion, because our form of life is no longer, if ever it was, in the order of bios, but is a politically qualified life, but in that of Merzoe, that is of bar life. The biopower, now dominant, has no other purpose than to govern bar life, dilating all its qualification. I don't think that Agamben has ever made use of it, but the belief that at the end of modernity, the human condition is nothing but bare life, that is a life at the same time sacred and expendable, is obsessive in many short novels written by Luigi Pirandello. I would like to refer to Sophio, a very strange short novel that begins in a grotesque way. An anonymous character, this circumstance is recurrent in Pirandello's last short novel, is announced by a friend, Calvetti, the death of a common friend. The character reacts to the news by noting that life is after all nothing more than a breath, and by joining the fingers of his hand, he blows on them. At the news of the death of his friend Calvetti, the anonymous character of the novel mechanically repeats the previous sentence and gesture, causing the death of the latter friends too. At this point, the grotesque tone became tragic. The protagonist begins to realize his terrible power to kill with a simple breath. If he is distressed or horrified, he immediately thinks of calling a doctor. However, contact with a doctor exacerbates the madness of the protagonist. He repeats the sentence, and he is about to repeat the gesture in front of the doctor. Having fled to the street to avoid further victims, the madness is unleashed, until the character discovers that he is no longer a man, but the epidemic itself. As surreal as it is, the short novel speaks of the reduction of man to bare life. A life that in Pirandello has the typical numinous traits studied by Rudolf Otto, something that is at the same time divine and terrible. According to Pirandello, life is the eternal flow of nature, but it also has a distressing power of destruction. Something similar can be found in Sophio, the short novel to which we have referred. There is neither premeditation nor calculation, nor goodness nor cruelty in the destruction of life by life itself. In the short novel Il Chiodo, Pirandello tells of a young who, without thinking about it, picks up a nail found by chance in the street. Shortly afterwards, he would use it to kill one of the two little girls accidentally met on the street. Immediately arrested, the boy listened imperturbably to the arguments and counter-arguments presented during the judicial hearing. None of them is true, not because they tell lies or distort reality, but because they presuppose that the boy has an independent personality, an autonomous capacity to want, while his murderous act was caused solely by circumstance. We could go on. Nevertheless, it is clear that this gloomy spectacle, which we could improperly call apocalyptic, derives from the loss of all identity. but Pirandello, as amply described in the novel Uno Nessuno e Centomila, one of his best-known works. Vitangelo Moscarda, the protagonist of the novel, having discovered that every identity is the violent social and at the same time metaphysical imposition of a form to their life, decides to sacrifice the first so that the second can flow without limits. Having collapsed all personal identity, even the link between name and reality, and with it the world language, Vitangelo Moscarda dissolves into a timeless and dumb becoming. Uno Nessuno Centomila was published in 1926, and some interpreters see in it the most optimistic expression of Pirandellian Weltanschauung. It may be true, Pirandello himself, after all, considered it his most positive novel. However, short novels like Soffio and Il Chiodo show what other consequences may arise from the loss of identity. To use Agamben's word, a barred life emerges, but is eternal and always killable. In Pirandellian terms, the barred life is an undistinct, unmentionable flow that respects no limit, no definition, and no human bond. Contrary to what might emerge from reading Uno Nessuno e Centomila, Pirandello was not enthusiastic about it. Exactly for this reason, for years, Pirandello sought in humorous art the true and non-violent form of eternal life. However, behind aesthetic consideration, it is no coincidence, thinking back to Agamben's work, that in the second half of 1920s, Pirandello decided to join the fascist party. Given his tragic vision of bare life, a strong national identity could seem the only remedy to the madness of the identity crisis. Well, according to Giorgio Agamben and Luigi Pirandello, the reduction of man to bare life has the apocalyptic consequence, in the broadest sense, of dissolving life into nothingness, that is, into nothingness of meaning. Yet there is, in the 20th century, at least another way to see the relationship between bare life and the search for meaning. In the same years in which Pirandello brought to light his radical nihilism, in Germany, and in particular at the University of Marburg, a fruitful collaboration was developing between Martin Heidegger, who was working on his fundamental work, Sein und Zeit, and the evangelical exegete and theologian Rudolf Bultmann. Assuming that Heidegger's philosophy is at least partly known, it is interesting that Bultmann's theological existentialism gives the word Zoe, which we have translated as bare life, a prominent place. The index of Greek terms on Bultmann's New Testament theology, the lemma Zoe occurs 7 times. Even if it has not the prominence of the word pistis, which objectively occupies the prominent place in Bultmann's work, the word Zoe still appears central. In particular, in the investigation of St. Paul's theology, Bultmann emphasized the dynamic between sarx and pneuma, that is, between proud human autonomy and the faith that life is a free gift from God. This is not the place to delve into Bultmann's theology. Anyway, it is interesting that the place of this decision in St. Paul's theology and in Bultmann's is indicated by the word Zoe, but is by the bare life. Zoe indicates in St. Paul and in Bultmann the human condition in a way qualified, but is the vitality of historical man as such, distinct from authentic and true life, but is from spiritual life. Nevertheless, at the same time, the word Zoe indicates the fact that man is confronted with the decision, that is the eschatological responsibility. It is the bare life, in short, that must decide in the face of the scandal of the cross. The bare life of man is Zoe, is called to decide for or against the word of the cross. The bare life can be scandalized by the cross and therefore remain closed into its flesh, in worldly existence, available to human self-affirmation, or it can open itself to eschatological life, entrusted only to the free gift of the Creator. The price of this decision is described in the literature of St. John with the expression Zoe aionios, that is eternal life. I quote for Bultmann: the price promised to fidelity is Zoe aionios. Zoe aionios in St. John is the eschatological salvation already present for the faith. Again, I cannot to go into the analysis of Bultmann's theology, which is very complex. I prefer to dwell on a single point, which in the past I had considered marginal, but which now, in the light of previous consideration, appears to me in a different light. As Agamben notes, Zoe expresses in Greek, I quote from Agamben, the simple fact of living common to all living beings, while bios indicated the form or way of life proper to an individual or a group. When Plato and Aristotle spoke of authentic life, contemplative life, or even political life, they could never use the term Zoe, for the simple reason that for both of them it was in no way in question the simple natural life, but a qualified life, a particular way of life. To speak of a Zoe politicae, of a citizen of Athens, would have made no sense. In the classical world, Zoe is excluded from the word of polis, as it is from the word of philosophical life. On the contrary, referring to the language and thought of the New Testament, Bultmann indicates precisely in Zoe the place where the decision of faith takes place. It was probably not in his intention, but by interacting Bultmann's observation with Agamben's, a different analysis of the present situation would seem possible. If Agamben is right, that man in modernity has been reduced to mere Zoe, and that the current security state due to the COVID-19 pandemic should be seen in this light, with Bultmann, we could suggest that all this is not the result of arcane strategies of power, but of what we could call Christian anarchism. On closer inspection, it is in St. Paul and in St. John that we find the reduction of political bios to mere Zoe. At the same time, this reduction may perhaps constitute a new opening to the decision of fate in the contemporary world. This is just a working hypothesis, which does not detract from the seriousness of a health emergency, as Agamben's critics have repeatedly pointed out to him, nor from the dangerousness of the security policies adopted by governments, especially the Chinese one, supinely accepted by the majority of the world population, as Agamben as well highlighted in his interventions. Without diminishing the seriousness of a health emergency and the possible political scenarios at stake, it is perhaps possible to see in the emergence of bare life a truly Christian dimension, that is to say, a result of Christianity and at the same time a new possibility for the decision of faith. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Enrico, for bringing attention to Agamben and his most recent interventions and his way to apply his concepts on the recent crisis, as well as for bringing other positions into this discussion, especially also the works of Pirandello, which is an author that is perhaps not that much discussed in philosophical circles, but has philosophical depth of an extraordinary range, I would say. The floor is open for discussions. Let me have a look to the chat. I dropped out in between, so I lost my connection today for the 6th time. My chat is empty, but I assume there are questions. Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. It's been a long time since I read anything by Pirandello, but I seem to remember that part of his analysis was based on the analysis of the mask, maschera, è questa dimensione dell'identità, identity which, if you take the mask away, there's nothing, which is of course destroying the whole Greek understanding of the person. On the other hand, we are living at a time possibly where we are united, at least in some ways, by masks. I'm in Rome, and in the beginning of February, I heard Italians laughing at people from Asia who are wearing masks and more obsessed about pollution, but now no one's laughing at all, and everyone is quite obedient, and it's become almost a fashion statement. So I'm interested to know, perhaps, does Agamben see this ambiguity between indossare un maschera and unity, taking on a mask, as something that brings about a new identity, or not?
Well,
yeah, let's go for that. I said we have 3 minutes left anyway only, and if everybody agrees, we could go on with your presentation, Todd. I think it doesn't make a lot of sense to wait in that case, since only 2 minutes, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So Todd, I'd say the floor is yours. Very welcome. And as I don't know, I think he left, said everybody perhaps should add a sentence of introduction so we know where everybody's from. Todd, you're from Chicago, the School of Psychology.
Yes, I'm coming from Chicago, and I'm at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology.
And
very glad to be a part of this group, and wanting to join you for quite some time, and I'm very happy and feverishly taking notes that stimulate me already into a variety of different contexts. It's really feeding my soul, so thank you. For my talk, I want to talk about what I call virally masked transcendence, and what I call once again flying too close to the sun. And the relationship between religious experience and pandemic events, of course, has an extensive history. The trauma, disorientation, and limit situations of pandemics activate ultimate concerns that can result in responses nothing short of madness. And current responses to COVID-19 have not disappointed us in the array of irrationality being displayed. Before I comment further on this matter, I wanted to frame a bit of who I am so as to offer context for my reflections. I'm one of the exotic zoo animals like the snow leopard or a strange breed of frog who stands at the interstices of various disciplines as a theologically trained, want-to-be continental and comparative philosopher of religion, a former chaplain, and a human science clinical psychologist working in a natural science-oriented psychology department and in quite a violent city. I align myself, though, with the tradition that sees existence as inherently religious, that is, as meaning-embedded, transcendent-seeking, enactments of significance in each and every moment, even during those times of despair and meaninglessness. Given that commitment, I see transcendence as ontological and inescapable, whether as transformation, metanoia, transfiguration, transubstantiation, conversion, cure, liberation, as we are forward-facing beings. Our aporia, though, is how can we take flight without flying too close to the sun or too low towards the sea? That is to say, is there a transcendence that is neither life negating in the Nietzschean sense, nor virally inattentive to the facticity in which transcendence takes place, nor so elitist that those of us who cannot keep up with it find ourselves as privations of its supremacism? With those orienting points stated, in these reflections, I wanted to unfold how what appears to be blatant irrational responses to this pandemic situation are actually supra-rational expressions of transcendence, each of them masked from their own awareness of embedded contingencies and inadvertent supremacist agendas. By transcendence, I mean the lived experience and comportments of over, beyond, above, and other. Our ability to transcend is our hope, but it's also our lie. The hubris and lack of stewardship of lived transcendence in these narratives, as they are lived today, more often than not, lead to tragedy. Florida reports a stunning acceleration of new COVID cases, and the state's response: open Disney World. And that just about says it all. And I could say good night right here, have a safe trip home, and sit down. But let's add that, let's add to that event others like drinking disinfectant to kill the coronavirus, or attending COVID as a hoax parties maskless. And we can see the transcendent power of lived values other than safety and health dangerously at work, and moreover, being much more contagious than COVID ever could be. Madness often gives birth to madness, and as a survivor myself twice over of COVID-19, I wanted to start my comments in a personal way of how the very context of transcendence is itself undecidable, which means, as I use it here, although of course borrowing from Derrida in John Caputo's work, a type of transcendence that isn't chosen but imposed, a transcendence that could be either liberating or oppressive, a transcendence that resists reducibility, conditionality, knowledge, certainty, and exactly when we most claw at them for our basic needs. During my own struggle with COVID-19, I remember vividly one night where I could barely breathe and was trying to discern whether to go to the emergency room or trust that my CPAP machine would be enough to get me through the night, while my partner, who was also positive with COVID, held my hand as we reminded ourselves to just breathe. Dum spiro spero. She too writhed in pain as COVID attacked her organs, something at the time we did not know COVID did, while our French bulldog steadied us at the helm, leaving us worried as to whether or not he could be infected. The word out about this concern, like every other concern, was mixed, if not contradictory, and undecidable. Yet the undecidability wasn't owned, and rather than providing "it depends" news feeds served definitive conclusions only to reverse themselves over and over again. This is maddening when you want to know what's trying to kill you. Each day, new symptoms were added that my partner, I, and others were experiencing, which are previously relegated as coming from some other kind of etiology. Our alarms to the presence of them minimized. Information continued to be posited, then reversed, such as whether to take ibuprofen. I have O positive blood and was supposed to not get COVID, but was told that I had a really bad case of it. My hair has become darker and not grayer at 58, and a hyperdontial wisdom tooth was boring its way to the surface decades after my wisdom teeth were removed, and I sounded psychotic even talking about it. I experienced the most violent vomiting I have ever experienced, but just assumed it was food poisoning, only to be told, nope, yet another typical COVID experience for some of us lucky ones. Our leading expert on infectious diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci, couldn't understand how a random, older, seemingly immune and healthy person facing the virus lives through it, while someone about 30 and seemingly healthy walks into the emergency room and is dead in 12 hours. We were initially told COVID produced only 3 symptoms and we'd make a full recovery in 14 days. The 3 symptoms became a longer list of symptoms each day, and the then prognosed 14 days has now extended into a post-COVID syndrome that is hiding its expiration date. I'm supposed to have antibodies, be immune and non-contagious, and can give plasma, but I can't trust this pronouncement. A pronouncement that yet again has been reversed. Now anyone can get COVID round 2. And at this writing, I'm experiencing post-COVID symptoms. Do you continue to stay put? Do I or anyone else travel? Should I see my aging and immune-compromised parents and risk infecting them? Hug my children who are inside elsewhere and risk infecting them? The residents next door where I live are on the deck, maskless with Bud Lights in their hands, laughing, and seem to be doing just fine, while others are losing multiple family members to COVID after mass gatherings that sadly lead to another kind of mass. Do antibodies mean certain immunity and non-contagion? Did I get infected in China in January or Jerusalem a month before that? Or at the local grocery store down the street, pressing an elevator button and then wiping my eye? I wasn't symptomatic until March, but did I have it? To all these questions and more questions, well, it depends. It's undecidable. My partner and I quickly quarantined anyway in case we were positive, and no one else we knew among our family and friends, our students, our clients got it. Good, but why not? And why us? Undecidable. We're told to stay inside, then told we can go out if we need supplies, but to wear masks and gloves, then just a mask, and then again only if closer than 6 feet, and now all the time when outside, except for those who have the mask half on and half off here in the United States. This kind of hermeneutical vertigo of incessant recontextualization and reframing of symptoms and the never arriving messianism of the end of this pandemic is enough for anyone to throw their hands up in the air and just say to hell with it, and do so in a variety of irrational ways. It very well may be that this kind of hermeneutical vertigo has something to do with why a recent study showed that 10% of the US population at present has seriously considered suicide, yet another form of transcendence. I suggest, though, that what appears to be irrational is rather supra-rational. The supra is an allegiance and commitment to live values other than the rational person's preference for and privilege of health and safety. Others will and do risk health and safety in a flight of teleological suspension of the rational towards values other than health and safety of oneself and others, such as freedom from legislation, embodied reconnections from pixel isolation, or social justice over public exposure. Lived values of any sort are expressions of transcendence. So rather than categorizing what is happening as rational or irrational, I see the matter as alternatively lived expressions of transcendence, albeit viral or therapeutic ones. It would be simpler just to say that the viral or irrational form of transcendence is any form of transcendence that tries to escape finitude, while a healthy or rational form of transcendence is any form of transcendence that embraces its factical contingencies. This is where I was heading when I started the paper, but discovered that this view missed the undecidability of any form of transcendence itself. We wear masks to transcend illness, but masking ourselves is also an act of subservience to legislated edicts, whereas not wearing a mask transcends impositions from on high, though obviously leaves ourselves and others vulnerable to infection, if not death. Each side believes themselves therapeutic and the other viral, each side seeing the other as unduly irrational. Yet any form of transcendence can be viral if by viral, revisiting Daedalus's warning to Icarus, we mean infected with hubris. Regarding transcendence, hubris is both in attending to or ignoring the factical contingencies that come along with transcendence, as our freedom is always and already situated, and confusing transcendence with a privileged vertical supremacism where the transcendent sees its flight as better than its privations. At the risk of slipping into a Sisyphean dilemma of offering a better than position to another better than view of transcendence, I still would suggest that a non-viral therapeutic form of transcendence is horizontal, multi-partial, relative, flexible, pliable, incessantly reinterpretable, and egalitarily dexterous, without these states being privileged over their opposites as privations. Its flexibility, for instance, is not a negation of rigidity, just a different form, or just different from it, with different concerns and different flight manifests. In a therapeutic transcendence, liberals talk with conservatives, and the inclusive include the exclusive. Therapeutic transcendence is an openness that understands why at times we're closed. Therapeutic transcendence seeks the coming of the vaccine, though can live without a cure. It privileges neither being nor non-being, and thus resides in the homelessness of chorus space, moving fluidly between various kinds of teleologies. Therapeutic transcendence is aware that existentially any pathway of transcendence gifts us as well as leaves us with a wake of mourning. Therapeutic transcendence cannot be prescribed, nor is it a correction of a deficit. It is an attending to rather than a doing to, a convention rather than an intervention. What this means is that while I breathe, I hope, but I will also plan for my death. If I have to stay at home, I will fully embrace inside voices and pixels, not because pixels are better than flesh, just because it's a different form of embodiment with its own integrity. Having worked for quite some time, both professionally and personally, with pain management, I quickly learned that pain is worse if you try to fight it. I now reach for the bottle of ibuprofen while simultaneously listening to what inflammation is telling me. In a COVID pandemic, I'll hope for my next breath and hope that my blood won't clot, but host the fear of the opposite and what the fear is teaching me about what or whom matters in my life. Although I prefer peace, comfort, and euphoria, pain, suffering, and dysphoria are not privations of these preferred experiences, but additional gifts to an open commensality. I will wear a mask, but still communicate. I will stay at home, but still spend money. I will mourn those who I've lost or could lose and hoist a smoky mezcal to those of us who are still here. My goal is not to die, but therapeutic transcendence sees transcendence in either direction. If alive, we can live for more possibilities within our contingencies and transcend death. If we die, we finally transcend the gravity of contingencies and don't have to shave anymore or pay the light bill. In both flights, we gain and lose. It's helpful to be accompanied by a coronaut, though, as we move through this trans space. Too often, I find as a psychologist that the therapeutics offered by the phenomenologist of religion have gone uncelebrated. The phenomenologist is, however, to use John Caputo's language, a cartographer of the soul and a radical hermeneut of happenings in the happening, all the way down, allowing us oxygen to breathe in a world short of breath. Reframes and bracketing literally save lives through differentiating and discerning experiential nuances of mourning and hope, both immediate and distant, and through radical bracketing, unfolding unowned frustrations, rational or not, when encountering the impossible. The Phenomenological Chaplain of Transcendence hosts the masked and the unmasked, offering a quadratic hospitality that is intimately familiar with undecidability, relative gradation, the irreducible, the unconditional, and the equalization of significance, such that we sit as well with the virally transcendent. The Phenomenological Chaplain allows virility to speak, to unconceal the lived experience of desired supremacist untouchability up above and the disdain for contingent saturation of facticity that pillages innocence, trust, and the hunt for the immutable. The phenomenological chaplain of transcendence lives the Kierkegaardian pain of the collision between the finite and the infinite, trying neither to fly too close to the sun or the sea, though pulled constantly to do both, all the while divining context in which and by which we move and have our being. Context situate and liberate simultaneously. It is where meaning is birthed and reframes are found, and where the transcendent is found in the immanent, the possible in the impossible. And this is the point, I think, of radical theology, and I would also say of the therapeutic moment. In choosing to close on a personal note, though, the more my symptoms were contextualized, the better I felt. Even when Dr. Fassi, our daedalus, remarked that he was as stumped as anyone else about COVID's unpredictability and complexity, it was sad, but also comforting. I knew I wasn't the only one who did not know. And if the expert did not know, I wasn't missing something. He stepped into chorus space with us, a kenosis balancing the hubris, though compassionately understanding it, and owned our shared undecidability. Icarus's wings continue to flap, whose image is blurred by COVID's heat and Daedalus's tears. What better person than the phenomenologist of transcendence to accompany us into this hell of bewilderment, particularly during flights of ultimate concerns activated by the traumas of pandemics and the pandemics of traumas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd. That was, to quote, how did you say, quoting Caputo, to get breath in a world out of breath. That was in some sense breathtaking.
Oh,
so yeah, well, thanks a lot for sharing things on a personal note, as well as offering something, what I would call a new grammar of transcendence. That's exactly what I got from that. And I think we have questions, we have remarks on that. I think Olga was the first, as I see here in the chat. Olga, please.
Thank you so much, Todd. What you reported, what you brought in is exactly what I mutedly was thinking about while questioning rationality. It's a comment rather than a question, but it seems that the reason is not just shadowed by crisis, but in this total bankruptcy of scientific response to COVID, even on the level of meaning making, not to say anything about the biological part of it, or the part purely related to the body. But the bankruptcy of this response is, in a sense, is a bankruptcy of reason on which this science is built. You know, it's the very logic by which we operate in knowledge carries some kind of deficiency. It's not just the deficiency of the self or deficiency of social aspect of our science or deficiency of political governance, but the very essence of how knowledge is coming through. I mean, Husserl spoke about the two types of knowledge. He didn't formally typify them, but he talked about Galilean science and then life world. But there is something third which appears to be needed in this current situation, because neither life world nor the Galilean model of science are coping simply. And this is exponentially increasing from the beginning of the virus infections in the 20th century. Each next one is adding more challenge. So thank you really very much.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
If there are any medical professionals, as I suspect are in the audience, anybody who worked with infections on large scale, I would really appreciate the input.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Todd. I think you take the remark as it stands.
Yes.
And would ask Jason, you to go ahead, because you also link it back to the last talk and Agamben.
Right. Thanks for your talk. That was really impressive.
Thank you, Jason.
And poetic, even in the midst of such a difficult time, I'm sure. So I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
Maybe you see my question in the chat box. I won't a bit of it there, but I just was thinking about what you mentioned about madness. And, you know, in Foucault, we see this idea of madness at the experience of the feeling of being watched and surveilled. But in our, what we call it, whatever age we're in right now, information age, age of fear, surveillance, despite that, there is an experience of being mad because we're not being surveilled. So it's kind of an inversion of Foucault, as I'm kind of interpreting you, over-interpreting you, I'm sure. But either we feel like our authorities were not there at all, or maybe they just fell asleep at the wheel, as I mentioned, or maybe they weren't even really monitoring us at all. They never cared about us. They were just busy focusing on data points and you know, economical machines and so forth.
Yeah, it's interesting just to, you know, like Olga was talking about, this sort of incompetencies of what we think is going to take care of us. It's almost like an inverted panopticon, not one that's monitoring us or eliciting data for control, but one that we thought was going to look after us. And you know, again, what's frustrating is the failure of reason is not owning its own failure. And in the communications, you know, the communications are speaking as if things are conclusive when they're not. And then you start getting the felt sense that they're feeling required to be conclusive, but conclusive for their own needs rather than actually attentive. And from the inside of the experience, it is, you know, Kafkaesque at least to live through symptoms, and you're asking, is this a part of what you're studying or concluding? And to hear continual contradictory conclusions about it. So you're right. There's a sense nobody's watching. And if they're watching just for their agendas and so forth. So. Absolutely. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Todd. Mike, you also have a pertinent question.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is something like this. I mean, I see that you really put your finger on the complexity of really knowing what's going on, what's the right position to take. It strikes me, each of us has to kind of do that in a kind of Husserlian exercise of rationality. You have to decide, you're responsible for deciding. It's always going to be fallible. There's always possibility that future data is going to show corrections needed all the time. But in a sense, there's also the possibility of saying, I think this is the right way to go right now in this disease. Especially because I'm concerned about hurting other people. That to me is one of the main issues. I don't want to do stuff that's going to cost someone else their life, so I'm worried about that. But in the course of that, I can come to the conclusion that's going to be different from what someone else thinks. And I may think they're wrong, really, in this situation. But without resorting to domination, maybe you need kind of a Levinasian context within which we disagree with each other. Where I say, yeah, I disagree, I see what you're doing, but here's why. But there's sort of respect for the other person who disagrees with me, as opposed to sort of bashing them or hating them or resorting to kind of ethical denunciations. How does that sound? I mean, I'm just...
Absolutely, and I think it is a very difficult kind of position. My position is put your mask on so you're not going to infect somebody and potentially kill them. And I do feel my own anger when I am moving about in elevators and walking through, particularly out in the U.S., in a very crowded, thick city, where there's just a blatant inattention to it. And I have my own sort of stance of values in relation to that. The trouble I'm finding, of course, is how the polarization doesn't seem to move us forward. There's a kind of stalemate with that. And at the same time, trying to figure out, almost like an Aikido move, if I can understand and let the speech of no one's going to tell me to put a mask on sort of speak without immediately being counter-reactive, maybe we can get to something of a win-win kind of place. But that's assuming somebody wants to play along, and that somebody wants dialogue. And so still trying to figure out how to work that out. I think we can't avoid taking a stand. I think existentially we can't get away from that. But can we do that without being hegemonic? But in the problem of not wanting to be, supremacists ourselves or dominating the other, are we allowing dangerous kind of comportment to destroy us? I think there's a time to fight, but mourn it, I guess, is another way to put it.
Good.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me have a look.
Stanley, go, Mike.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes, Stanley, are you here? Here you go. I don't hear you.
So, yeah, sorry about that. My mic's not working very well. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Stanley, I can hear you well.
Okay.
Thank you for your question.
So I was just very struck by that, by the comparison that you made between kenosis and hubris. So the question's just there. So this points towards a sort of a self-emptying rationality. And so I wonder how much this emptying of self, getting myself, almost, I wouldn't say negating, but reducing the importance of the self as a means of, as an antidote, as in how, but I guess the difficulty is that I can do that, but the other people may not be. So just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that last comment is kind of what I was mentioning in terms of Mike's comment about that and what to do when others don't want to, play along. But the kenosis, again, I think is an antidote to the soul in a way of trying to address the matter. And for me, kenosis would be similarly to accepting what Olga was talking about, is a kind of a letting go of and an embracing of a kind of an emptiness that we're experiencing together. I think that's what I was feeling personally when Dr. Fossey said, after 50 years of studying infectious diseases, I don't know what's going on with this thing. And it should terrify us for him to say that, but I honestly felt great comfort. There's a comfort in his kenosis, I think, that invited me to feel, you know, I'm not the one out of the loop. And it's very scary if you're experiencing the symptoms, not knowing, is this allergies or is this hacking cough they're talking about from COVID? Which one is it? And how long is it going to last? But I do think mentally, spiritually, it's very, very difficult, I think, to survive this without embracing an unknowing, a letting go, a Gelassenheit sort of comportment in the world. And I don't think communications about COVID are even close to getting to this kind of conversation on a mainstream level. This experience has hurt the soul in ways that I think we're not clear of yet, or certainly not talking about it. And the stats are the 10% of U.S. considering suicide right now is coming from the National Institutes of Health. And so I'm not surprised at all. As a therapist, I am swamped, unfortunately. And it's getting really to a critical mass. And the question, I think, is can we by choice and agency put our own selves into a kenosis, or are we thrown into it? And that's where I think a little of both. I think that's what Carl was trying to talk about this morning with that. So, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Todd. Maybe just want to follow up a little bit on the discussion, because it's been also in the preceding section or session that Levinas has already been mentioned, and he's been in the air right now again. And I think what is so interesting about Levinas and his ethics of the other is that it is somehow built on Jewish foundations, but in fact he uses the kenosis, the concept. Yeah, in fact, he takes it over, and he somehow conceives of the subject and subjectivity and subjection in terms of a kenotic subject. So there is a small text from Levinas on the Christian conception of kenosis, and that gives a clue how he was able to integrate these very two different traditions. So that's a very, very interesting take on the issue. What I found so interesting is in this, as I put it, the new grammar of transcendence you're proposing, it strikes me that you used the term transcendence quite univocal, but it isn't univocal at all. Yeah, I mean, it's not the traditional conception of transcendence, right, we know from ontotheology and from the metaphysical tradition. But in your account, it strikes me as most important that transcendence in a more traditional way, as an experience of whatever, be it supernatural or not, is very closely tied to what we might call self-transcendence. On the one hand, and also to an intersubjective dimension of transcendence, which is what is celebrated in the religious traditions most significantly, which is also perhaps an explanation why people stick to religious practices that endanger them in times of pandemics, because there is a basic need for intersubjective, inter-affective encounters which people can't be living without. So that strikes me as a very interesting triangle with different conceptions of how might we think transcendence. That's not a unified, that's not a monolithic concept. But we need to understand how we, in our experiential life, in our bodily life, in our intersubjective relationships, are transcending beings.
Right.
And that in a variety of different perspectives. And that's, I got a grip on that in what you said. So more a remark, and question if I got that rightly, what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. But so right at the end of your comments, that an embodied living of transcendence is what I'm finding interesting. But what happens when the destinations are different in terms of the values that are pulling us? And I think that's where we are. And where what is important for Levinas that comes in terms of what I was talking to Mike about earlier with his question is, is trying not to reduce the other to my sameness, but to what extent do we have when we come up on the line of making sure that I don't dismiss the other's flight of transcendence unless it's trying to kill me. And so where is the line in relation to that? But I think that embodied living of transcendence is inherent in what it means to be human. And our discernment, though, is that, like I mentioned in the papers, what's the flight manifest of different people in terms of where they're heading. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mike, Bill's question maybe, or Bill's
comment. Bill wrote again. Wonderful. Bill, please, concluding question.
Oh, okay. I didn't expect to be addressed. So I had a number of questions, but they're all somewhat related. I'm glad we brought up Marion, and because so my understanding of the COVID has been that it can be viewed as something like a saturated phenomenon, and there are of course various responses to this saturation, and fleeing, even transcendence. And so the question that Olga referred to was the one that I was addressed at the end. And that is that there are some situations that cannot be fled, that cannot be escaped. We can think of Heidegger's being towards death as one instance of that. And so, would we need resources, or what are the resources we have in dealing with our own impotence, right? And we can finally accept our impotence in this regard. And we can't fly toward the sun, we can't flee. Our feet are in the mud. Yeah.
Indeed, and I think that's kind of where when I talk about the chaplain, the phenomenological chaplain, sort of the response is how to help us come to terms with what we can't escape or our finitude. And I think a lot of it has to do with sort of looking at how we've been conditioned by values of ascendancy, different kind of transcendence, or an inauthenticity that doesn't own that we're not escaping in varying kinds. But there's something about kenosis or vulnerability or the incomplete that are all negative, that are seen as failures in conceptualizations. And I think on a therapeutic level, that's why I like the whole lineage of weak thought, Vattimo and Caputo, and sort of as things are progressing with weak being a force itself, kenosis being a powerful experience itself rather than something that, again, is a privation of strength. And I think when people begin to realize there's an unburdening by letting go, one isn't failing to be autonomous and a sort of very skewed and viral understanding of an Ubermensch themselves if they link arms with others. I think shifting again a valuation of those ways of being in the world can be a way to do that. I think though we're, like Carl Jaspers would talk about thrown into a shipwreck kind of experience. I think certainly COVID has shipwrecked us and forced us into existential communication where we have to link arms and move towards that together. I do think it's easier to go there with somebody else.
Wonderful. Thank you, Todd. I think what you communicated very well is that what Freud called the prosthetic God who is never able to be really happy, is now really crushed against the wall. So what Levinas said once about what is the definition of pain, it's the impossibility of recoil. That's exactly what's happening. So when there is no recoil, reason discovers, to quote Levinas, that it's ventriloquy. Yeah. So, and that is the problem of reason, that it's not responsive. It is simply communicating to itself, and that is what Levinas wants to escape from. Therefore, we need something, to quote Olga, we need something like a non-indifferent kind of reason, but it is something that we need to develop first. So I think perhaps we have some first steps taken, and well, simply
Michael, I'm
Thank
sorry
you
to sorry to interrupt. Sorry to delay. There is a very important comment on the group chat, which we should not leave unaddressed. And this is the reason, because the person who brought in this comment is a clinical professor. He is a physician, professor from the University of Wisconsin, I believe, Louis. For many years, he worked worldwide with different diseases, with different pediatric population. And his comment on kenosis is, I think, something we can hear out. He doubts the wisdom of kenosis. For me, as a scientist or former scientist, the same objection came up. So I don't know how you can weave it in time-wise, but just take a notice.
Yes, please. Luis, if possible, please let us know the question in person. That will be much better, I think. He doesn't seem to be in.
Luis, are you here? Can you hear us?
Wait a second.
I've unmuted.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I found it very interesting that Todd, if I can use his first name.
Yeah, please.
That you brought up the aporia that are involved in COVID-19, but in fact, historically, that is a feature, not rare, with all epidemics. And this aporia, and I think you brought this out importantly, does bring out in the bare life that people are reduced to bring it back to the previous talk, that reduces the valence of rationality. And it is a feature, not simply common or uncommon, a feature of epidemics historically, that this rationality brings a commitment frequently to being filled, as you will, because we become empty, with very mischievous ideas. And this mischief can be seen in the United States in terms of many people seeking relief, transcendence, in various mischievous, angry, violent activity and beliefs. So I would like you to think a moment, and perhaps because you've given this some great thought, how we might think about this, these aporia bringing out mischief.
Certainly the gap invites the mischief, and I guess you know, for me, you know, part of what I see in terms of the violence again are different manifestations of transcendence, but for me it would be the opposite of a kenosis. I see it as an economy of acquisition, or an economy of protest, of communicating that one is not attending to their otherness, and that the responsive violence, for instance, is a way to kind of communicate that. It's still possessing and trying to achieve something to gain rather than an emptying. And I think in reception to agendas of violence or transcendent pathways of violence is a kind of kenosis that I think can disarm it, but to what extent? So certainly that's, you know, whenever reframes open up other possibilities, you know, Hermes is present and the trickster is present, and it can certainly be seductive into filling the emptiness with one's own agendas. But people fill agendas to communicate, you know, a kind of inversion of Levinas's concern not to reduce the other to a kind of protest of why one's otherness has felt reduced. Then I think it's something that is a transcendence of achievement rather than emptying. But it's an interesting debate in terms of how to understand which way it goes. I think you sort of transcendent pathways of violence are trying to empty others rather than empty themselves. And I'm curious how that, you know, will fare it out.
I feel it's important to comment, bringing up Levinas and the other, that an almost universal feature historically of great epidemics or pandemics has been the othering of some people, ethnic strife, the labeling of some other as evil, frequently Jews, but here we have Chinese in the United States. We need to be, or Muslims, but this is a characteristic historically of great epidemics.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important in discussions of otherness not to tack on a supremacist agenda in what we mean by other.
Okay, I would say now things would get very complicated, especially as the very concept of alterity in Levinas is not uncontested itself. That would bring us to other issues, and I think we've already discussed a little bit nature as something that could, to quote Bill and Mario via Bill, could also be thought of as a saturated phenomenon that requires response, like animals, etc., which are topics that are not treated by Levinas in terms of his ethics of alterity. But anyway, I think, Todd, you've given us really a very, very interesting outline and good arguments to go on, which need to be discussed in further detail. Thanks again. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you all very, very much.